All right. Thanks for joining today, guys. My name is Ryan. I handle a number of the commercial partnerships for our offshore wind team at SGN. The third Thursday of every month, we will host a brief presentation covering current and relevant offshore wind topics. So be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and sign up for our monthly newsletter for updates on all future events. These monthly discussions, they're short, sweet, and to the point, and it is purposefully kept to 19 minutes as we want you to get the most value with no huge time commitments. But for those of you that do not know who SGN is, SGN, we are a market intelligence and data analysis company for the ocean industries, operating in three primary segments. That's rigs, shipping, and offshore wind. And within our global offshore wind platform, we help the industry from investors and developers to suppliers and everyone in between make sense of what is going on in the offshore wind market. As many of you know, there's been tremendous growth and activity. The offshore wind industry is facing many challenges, and it's quite chaotic. Every decision tends to be a trade-off between risk and reward, and our goal is to simplify and bring transparency and clarity to the industry. So within our offshore wind analytics platform, you'll be able to see who's bidding, who's winning in the auctions, who lost, who's partnering together, where it's happening, when it's happening, and with what type of equipment and what vessels. And if you'd like more information on our wind analytics tool or hold a discussion, I'd encourage you to reach out directly to myself and we can have a discussion around that. But in addition to our wind analytics platform, we specialize in understanding and documenting the carbon footprint of a wind farm. And as an independent third party, we assist developers, companies, and consortia. And in today's discussion, we will concentrate on the rising focus on carbon footprint in offshore wind lease rounds. And with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Ajay, who will discuss the meat of the presentation here. Ajay, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Ryan. So, yeah, like you said, the offshore wind market is in very strong growth. That's no secret. Loads of new areas are being offered to the market. But what we also see is an increasing awareness that the offshore wind industry is, after all, a heavy industry with a significant carbon footprints in both the development phase and also on the operational and maintenance phase and the decommissioning. If we put this in perspective, so with increasing size of turbines and structures, so if you take one single structure, including the foundation, tower, nacelle, blades, one of these structures have the weight equivalent to the Eiffel Tower in Paris, meaning that if you have a project with 50 wind turbines, it's equivalent to putting 50 Eiffel Towers out in the ocean. And this is something that the European countries are increasingly taking into consideration in lease rounds now, namely what the carbon footprint of the offshore wind projects is. We see that several European countries, that the lease rounds are becoming more competitive, and also that sustainability is increasingly being used as a criteria to assess and differentiate bids in the bidding rounds. And what that means is that carbon footprint estimates is not necessarily only something you have to submit and tick off that box, but that the carbon footprint of your projects could be that one decisive thing that makes you win or lose a development area. But including sustainability, carbon footprint as a selection criteria is still relatively new and something that hasn't been fully applied anywhere. So in the Netherlands, you had the HKW round that was awarded at the end of last year. There you had some scoring mechanisms around ecology and biodiversity. And in Germany, they have incorporated some requirements around emissions to water. It was actually France during the AO4 round. That was the first time that carbon footprint was introduced in a lease round. But how it was done there was that they set this kind of what they call the C max or the carbon max, which was a minimum carbon footprint criteria that had to be met in order to submit a bid for that round. And then you have a few new countries that have a partly different approach, which hasn't been finalized yet though, but that's like Norway and Belgium. We have very strong signals that carbon footprint will be a selection criteria, or one of the selection criteria in the coming auction rounds for Princess Elizabeth in Belgium and Sørlige Nordsjø II and Utsira Nord in Norway.
Yeah, Ajay, if you don't mind me interrupting, does that mean that these countries they're collaborating on defining a framework to estimate the carbon footprint from offshore wind projects?
We don't have any kind of indications that there is any kind of collaboration between the countries, or that there is a kind of a shared or a common approach to how these frameworks will be defined. Not as we know, and I think it's an interesting question because Denmark, they launched a public consultation now a couple of weeks back, where they have asked stakeholders for feedback on which sustainability and environmental criteria should be considered for future offshore wind lease rounds in the Danish part of the North Sea and in Kattegat and Baltic Sea. But then, as you can see from the slide here, that although we have strong indications that carbon footprint will be part of the coming lease rounds in Belgium and in Norway, the frameworks and the standards haven't been defined yet. And for all we know, the methodologies might vary from one country to another, making the approaches different, but also the comparison of projects across countries very difficult, if not impossible. But that being said, the trend is clear. More and more criteria are being introduced around sustainability in auction rounds. And when it comes to climate regulations, climate legislations, that's something that tend to be kind of quite many years ahead in time. But when it comes to carbon footprint in offshore wind lease rounds, although we still don't have much clarity on the requirements around carbon footprint, for instance, what's clear is that these criteria are coming very fast, and they're coming already this year. So on this chart, you see, this is pulled out from our Wind Analytics platform, where you see that the blue bars, those are the tender process period, and the diamonds are the auction deadlines. And now we are at the end of the first quarter, 2023, and already from the second quarter, so the coming quarter, there will be auction rounds that include some kind of a selection criteria on sustainability or carbon footprint. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to make a deeper dive into the proposal for the pre-qualification criteria for Sørlige Nordsjø II and Utsira Nord in Norway, because I think that process is very interesting because it reflects the potential pitfalls and also advantages that lie in including carbon footprint assessments in offshore wind lease rounds. The criteria haven't been finalized. They will be published by the end of this month, so meaning within 10 days or so. But anyway, so when the draft criteria were published in December last year, what the Norwegian government said was that one of the criteria might be to include the carbon footprint of the proposed project measured in emissions per installed capacity, so basically emissions per kilowatts. And the developer or the applicant was to specify the methodology of the estimate and also the system boundaries of the carbon footprint. And this carbon footprint estimate will be part of the overall scoring of the application, and a lower carbon footprint would have a positive impact on the overall score. So that's kind of what was slated out in December when the proposal was published. So what we did at SGN is that we went through all the public consultation responses around the proposed carbon footprint criteria. And it was very clear that the respondents or the stakeholders were very aligned and also, I would say, concerned around the lack of this predefined framework or a predefined methodology on how to calculate the carbon footprint. So some of the feedback was around that the projects are still in such a preliminary phase that any kind of carbon emission assessment would be very uncertain, very inaccurate, and that a roadmap or a more qualitative strategic plan for decarbonization was to be preferred. But the main feedback was that in the absence of a clearly defined and standardized framework or methodology on how to estimate this carbon footprint, it would be very difficult or basically impossible to compare the applicants' carbon footprint estimates against each other, which again could incentivize having an overly optimistic view on your project's carbon footprints. And there's also concerns around the system boundaries, because by fact, companies, or it would be having narrow boundaries will automatically give you a lower carbon footprint. While if you, on the other hand, you're more ambitious and you kind of have a very broad understanding of your system boundaries, basically when you start counting your emissions and when you stop counting your emissions, that would give you a higher carbon footprint. And therefore, being more ambitious, having broader system boundaries could actually penalize you in the assessment phase of the lease round. But all in all, so most of the feedback around on the carbon footprint proposal was the importance of having a standardized framework and a methodology for carbon or for estimating the carbon footprint that could both reduce the uncertainty but also allow for comparability and consistency. And when it comes to the carbon footprint and emissions calculations, we believe that it's utterly important to have some clear boundaries in order to get some sensible results that are consistent and comparable. And there are basically three dimensions that need to be aligned to allow for this consistency and comparability. And that's first of all, the system boundaries. So they need to be defined, meaning that you need to have clarity on when you start counting your emissions and when you stop counting your emissions, what kind of emissions to include and what kind of emissions to exclude. So that's one element. Which part of a project phase or which part of a project development is included in your carbon footprint. And secondly, you have the components boundaries, and that's about which activities, which components within the different modules in the system boundaries are to be included in your estimate. And then you also need to ensure that the calculations are based on a given set of carbon factors so that one doesn't play the numbers or you're overly optimistic about the carbon content in your materials, that you can't do some kind of creative accounting, that the carbon factors are given, or at least as close to reality as possible. And finally, then it would also be beneficial that the final estimation comes with some kind of a documentation that explains the underlying assumptions and the calculations behind your carbon footprint number. And then the reason why I keep banging on about Norway here is that Norway is the first country that will most likely include carbon footprints as a criteria in offshore wind lease rounds. And the final criteria will be published within the next couple of weeks or within the next 10 days or so. And being the first mover gives you some advantages, because then you can define your framework more freely. You are more flexible in how you define your approach. But being a first mover also comes with some responsibilities then, because other countries will be looking towards Norway and how it's done in Norway. And the approach Norway takes can easily become the framework that's duplicated by other countries. So it can become a norm in other countries as well. And interestingly though, when we're talking about the clarity on methodology and framework, there is already an internationally recognized framework in place that will allow for the consistency and comparability when comparing the carbon footprints of various offshore wind projects. If you follow the ISO 14040, 14044 standards, these define a framework and a methodology for a life cycle analysis of a product or a process, including emissions to air, emissions to land, and emissions to water. So if a carbon footprint assessment is based on this standard, one doesn't have to wonder which system boundaries to set or which components or activities that are to be included within the system boundaries or which carbon factors to use in the calculations. All these elements will be given by the standard, or well, they won't be given by the standard, but the standard give you the framework and the methodology on how to do this. And that would then ensure both consistency and comparability and leave very limited room for any kind of creative accounting or being overly optimistic. And then if one's carbon footprint comes out exceptionally low, one would also have to explain why the number is such an outlier. And I guess that when it comes to kind of SGN's approach to this, how we do this, if I may just highlight why we stand out, is that our model is first of all based on the ISO 14040 and 14044 standards. But first of all, we are also an independent third party, and we are also unique in the sense that when the carbon factors element, so the third box from the top there, we can add far more accuracy into those numbers. Because in a conventional way of estimating the carbon footprint is to use a recognized carbon factor database that would give you average carbon factors for various raw materials, for various activities, whether it's transportation, installation activities, seaborne transportation, etc. And those would be based on generic data, so regional averages, global averages, and based on then you create your own carbon footprint assessments. But at SGN, what we do is that we combine our quantitative models for offshore wind, for shipping, and for rigs. And there we can quantify or we can estimate the activities and the associated emissions coming from these activities. So what we do then is that we raise the accuracy of the carbon footprint estimation by increasing the amount of activity-specific data and reducing the amounts of generic data that goes into this model. And this is something we can do when projects are still in very early phases and far away from being fully developed design-wise. So what we do then is that we increase both the accuracy of the estimate, but we can also allow for sensitivity analysis, scenario assessments at a very detailed level. So as an example, our model showed that if you transport equipment or components from, say, Southeast Asia to the North Sea, only selecting to do that voyage in a season with calmer water compared to when the weather is harsher, you can reduce the emissions from that transportation by 5%. So you can go in there and do these sensitivity analysis and actually see how you can specifically decarbonize parts of your activities in the development or operations of a wind farm.
Excellent. Thanks, Aja. It was extremely informative. I do want to remind everyone that's on the call today that we are helping consortia, developers, and companies, not only with carbon footprint reporting, but also analysis. So I do encourage everyone that is on this call, if you need additional information or to reach out directly. We're here to help in any way we possibly can. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. I did promise we'd keep this to 19 minutes, and it looks like we are on the 19-minute mark right now to keep this nice and efficient. But Ajay, if you want to go to the last slide here real quickly.
There we are. Oops, sorry. Give me one more second. There we are.
Perfect. The most important slide here, our contact information. So here's Ajay's contact information, my contact information. Feel free to reach out directly by phone or email. We encourage that, and obviously our the QR codes for the sign up for our mailing list. Again, thanks everyone, and we will see you the third Thursday of next month, hopefully for our next topic. Thanks again.